I wonder how a degenerated person like that could have reached a position of responsibility in the Army Medical Corps.
He was drafted.
Hello and welcome once again to the Cine-Files, where each week we enter the world of a great film and we explore its themes, the history of the filmmaking, and the influence it has on us today. My name is Steve Morris, and I am a filmmaker and directing instructor in Los Angeles, California.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Rocha. I'm a writer, producer, and host here in San Diego, California, voiceover guy, and former 8-year member of the U.S. Army.
One thing we always are trying to say at the beginning of our show is that we have our incredible supporters on patreon.com/the Cine-Files, as well as Apple Podcasts. And part of the reason we're doing this right now is that we went to our Cine-Files advisory board and had a fantastic conversation about the life and career of Donald Sutherland, who we lost a few weeks ago, and how best to honor him on the show. And what their suggestion was, and I think you and I kind of jumped on it right away, was to do not one, but two films of Donald Sutherland showcasing different moments in his career. And the first one is what we're starting on today, which is MASH. And the second one is a decade later in the film directed by Robert Redford, Ordinary People. And I just thought their suggestion was absolutely fantastic. And I'm very excited to be digging into this right now.
Yeah, I mean, how can I say this? I am a Robert Altman respecter, but I don't know if I would ever buy a Robert Altman movie on Criterion or otherwise. So I have a healthy respect for him as a director, but I haven't necessarily run out to see a lot of his movies. So this was a great way for me to see MASH for the first time. I've never seen MASH. I loved the TV show, but I'd never seen the movie because, I don't know, I just never felt the inclination to watch the movie. I was in the play back in school, but I was never had the inclination to see the movie, and got to watch it for our conversation, which occasionally happens. It's always a fun thing when it happens too, because it's an interesting conversation that it leads to for us on the show.
No, and in particular, seeing a movie like this for the first time after, I'm assuming you are pretty familiar with the TV show and the world. And that's just, and I would say for most people, they are way more familiar with Alan Alda and Mike Farrell and David Ogden Stiers and that cast, those
Jake
people,
Barr.
rather than Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould and Tom Skerrit. These are very, very different people. And there's this really, and because it's literally shot on the same sets, like and you have The Suicide is Painless, and you have like that. There is a completely weird, like you're in an alternate timeline. Yeah. This is the multiverse. And we're seeing a different version of the same thing. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, and I love that Altman hated the show. He said he hated the show because it was antithetical to what his movie was supposed to be about. And that's like, well, because this show was supposed to serve a different master than your film was serving, right? So it's two completely different things. But a majority of the people really love the TV series for maybe shaving off some of the edges that are there in the movie that we're going to be talking about. And I love the TV series for that. I still think it captured what it was intending to capture, but maybe with a softer punch into a velvet glove instead of a harder punch, as he was trying to say throughout this movie with Ring Lardner Jr.'s script.
Well, I mean, Robert Altman saying he hates the TV show, and I've heard this quote from him now multiple times. I've seen him say it multiple times. I don't know what the hell he watched. You know what I mean? Like, how many episodes of the 11 seasons of MASH did he watch to come up with the idea that, because, and we'll talk about this all the way at the end of our conversation, but like the idea of making a network sitcom based on what you just watched for the first time in this movie is crazy. And if I were Robert Altman, I'd be opposed to it too,
Yeah. It's a pretty, for a black comedy, it veers into a lot of darkness.
It's dark.
And some of the comedy is really unsettling through 2024 eyes for sure. So the fact that the people who created the show were able to figure out what would make this funny and how to soften the characters in the show, and yet still give them multidimensionality, especially Hot Lips with Loretta Swift's performance, which I thought was great in the show, I think speaks volumes about their creativity with taking this material and understanding how to adapt it into a different medium and make it work for all those years, to the point that it's still the most watched season finale or series finale of any TV show ever.
And deservedly so, in my opinion. Yeah. And I'll just say it right now, which is if you join us on patreon.com/the Cine-Files or Apple Podcasts, our next two, at least, and I could talk about this a lot more, Cine-Files shorts are going to be on the TV series MASH. So we can both talk about maybe some of our favorite episodes, our favorite cast members, our favorite moments, what made that show so special and unique. And I honestly, frankly, if there were other TV shows other than Star Trek and The West Wing to do podcasts on, MASH would probably be on the top of my list. So I have a lot to say on this, and I know you love the show as well. So that's patreon.com/the Cine-Files, or you can subscribe to the feed right in Apple Podcasts and get those upcoming Cine-Files shorts.
Absolutely. And also, and please don't forget everybody who's listening to us. You know, if you hear our sponsors every week on the show, we are so grateful and happy to have those sponsors coming aboard and supporting us here on the Cine-Files. And if any of those products really appeal to you, we so encourage you all to try them out and use our code so they keep coming back and sponsoring us as we're doing the show, because we love having them aboard. We love having you all aboard. And so if maybe a product appeals to you and you want to try it out, please make sure you use our code so we get a little bit of the benefit from that. And it's your way of saying thank you to us as well, and us saying thank you to you.
Absolutely. And let's start off with the whole reason that we started here, which is Donald Sutherland. And I wanted to give just a little bit of biographical information on this. I mean, talk about an incredibly diverse career lasting 50 plus years. He was born in New Brunswick in Canada in 1935. He was a sick kid. He had rheumatic fever, hepatitis, and polio growing up.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah. Studied acting, went off to study in London at the London Academy of Dramatic Art, started appearing in West End productions, joined a Scottish repertory company for 18 months, ended up on British TV. He acted with Christopher Lee in low-budget horror movies in London before coming back to the U.S. That's on an episode of the TV series The Avengers, no relation to Marvel Comics, was on The Saint. And then it's 1967, a movie we talked about years ago, but still one of my favorites, that he has a star-turning performance pretending to be a general in The Dirty Dozen.
Where are you from, son?
Madison City, Missouri, sir.
Never heard of it.
And then that's really what put him on the map. He goes from a nobody actor to somebody they're interested in. And in 1970, he does two movies that basically back-to-back, which is MASH and Kelly's Heroes.
Yeah. Two completely different performances, by the way. Both of them, of course, military connected, but very interesting to see how he found the comedy in one film and how he found the style of comedy in another film, and make them both work for what was going on in both of those movies.
And then he becomes one of those peculiar, odd actors of the 70s that achieves this really surprising star status. You know, the 70s in particular was this time where it's like, oh no, we can follow this odd Dustin Hoffman guy, or this John Voight guy, or this Elliot Gould guy, and of course Donald Sutherland. And he is in movies, which, by the way, so many movies that got talked about when I was in film school came up at this time. Three of the big ones are Clute, Don't Look Now, and 1978's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. These are one my film professors brought up to show visuals, to show to sound design, camera technique, like all sorts of stuff came up from these films.
Yeah. I look forward to the day we tackle Clute, because that's one I haven't seen either. And I know Jane Fonda won the Best Actress performance for that movie. And
I saw it once in film school. So that's 30 plus years ago. And that's the only time I ever saw it. And then the movie that I really saw the most of Donald Sutherland in more ways than one was, of course, he shows up in Animal House as the sort of stoner professor.
It's almost like he graduated from MASH to Animal House in terms of this kind of commentary comedy on what was going on in society, and this subversive comedy against the establishment and the madness of it all in society. When you see him in Animal House, he is now older and he's the professor, whereas he was more like the, what do you call it? Like the class clown in the movie MASH, which we're going to get into, obviously. But like in Animal House, he's much more of the professor type energy, older energy, which I think is fascinating. But still, of course, obviously, hooking up with the ladies.
I think there is no Animal House without MASH.
Oh,
frankly.
100%.
I there's so much of that anti-authoritarianism or anti-authority that happens. And what's so interesting about both MASH and Animal House is that they're these taking down the establishment movies.
Yeah.
Which then, looking at them decades later, we might be for the taking down the establishment, but then a lot of the stuff they're doing, you go, ugh, I don't know if I feel comfortable with this.
Yeah. And of course, they spawn some, I would say, 80s bastard stepchildren in like Revenge of the Nerds or Porky's, these type of movies that take they take some of the bent of both those movies and go in a completely different direction too far.
Well, and this, you brought it up at the beginning, and I might as well address it here, which is that I know, because we see the comments, that there are people that listen to the show that get very frustrated with us and our 2024 eyes looking at old movies and criticizing certain choices they made in terms of race or sexism or things like that. And I also know that there are people that see these movies for the first time and are offended by this stuff and really bothered that we're celebrating films that have this stuff. And I think actually MASH is like the perfect place to have this conversation because of the way it handles things. Is that I don't think in MASH we're supposed to just go, this is awesome. Everything Hawkeye and Trapper do is great. I don't think we're supposed to feel that way.
Yeah.
And yet we could also be fun watching them do a horrible thing sometimes, because sometimes comedy comes out of pain and all sorts of weird stuff,
Yeah, well, and I do want to say, like, I understand if people are upset about that. I will understand it, but I also think that we are an honest podcast and we give you our honest feelings about these movies. And I would hope that our analysis, when you listen to it, isn't just this good, this bad, that we really go deeper into why the reasons are, and we give our points of views. That being said, you're still allowed to love the movie.
Totally.
You're still allowed to like those parts of the movies that may make us uncomfortable. And trust me, there are parts coming in this movie in our conversation. I'll just preview it now that make me uncomfortable. And so, but that's okay, because that's part of enjoying a film, is an analysis and breaking it down and approaching it from a certain direction. Like Animal House is a film that we have circled many, many times, but there are concerns about certain things. But I still love that movie from top to bottom. And when we ever decide to do it, I will happily do it, also happily accept the criticism, and also happily still decide at the end of the day that I enjoy that movie when I watch it. So I think that's what I would encourage people who want to get stuffy about this whole thing. Like, relax. We're just talking about it. We're having our own opinions. You're still entitled to yours as much as we are entitled to ours.
Absolutely. So back into the career of our great Donald Sutherland. He goes on after The Great Train Robbery with Sean Connery, movie I've never seen. He goes on to our next film that we're going to do on the Cine-Files, which I haven't seen in 20, probably 30 plus years, which is Ordinary People.
Yeah.
Which wrecked me. I think I watched it once, was wrecked, and went, I don't need to do that again until apparently 40 years later when we do a podcast on it. And then I think Ordinary People is like the turning point for him, because he goes from being that quirky, interesting star of the 70s to being one of the great supporting actors for the next 40 years.
Yeah, 100%. With so many things that he's done, and there are those utility players that you call in to come into your movie and they nail it. Christopher Plummer, Samuel L. Jackson. There are just so many great utility players that if you can get them onto your movie, at least those sections of the movie are handled, and so Donald Sutherland became that for many, many years.
And you have movies like A Dry White Season, Backdraft, 6 Degrees of Separation, of course, 1991 JFK, where we talked about how it does exactly that, comes in and slays it with one giant monologue. And there's Disclosure, Outbreak, Citizen X, Time to Kill, 2000. In 2000, we have Space Cowboys, Cold Mountain, of course, his role in The Hunger Games. Many people have considered to be one of the greatest actors to never be nominated for an Oscar.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
It's crazy.
He's been a lead and a character actor, an ensemble actor. I mean, it's just mind-blowing how he's never been nominated for an Oscar. But maybe that one role didn't come along that separated him from everyone else for that one particular year, right? It's like sports. You go, wait, how many rings does Charles Barkley have in the NBA? None. What? How come this other scrub has 5? So it's just, you just never know. It's all about timing sometimes, and for whatever reason, he never quite got that role that could have put him over the finish line for that particular year. And it's a shame. But, sometimes being beloved is worth more than any gold statuette you get from the Academy. And he will be beloved forever, man.
And he did get the gold statuette because he got the honorary Oscar in 2017, which I can't imagine the emotions of like,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, a lot of actors hate that shit. Like
Yeah.
Peter O'Toole, when they gave it to him and he was still working, he was so upset about it. But
Yeah.
but with something like Charlie Chaplin, it carries much more weight, obviously, in resonance because of his story. But I bet a majority of the actors who get that are like, thanks, but you couldn't recognize me while I was actually doing my greatest work. But I appreciate it. This is nice.
So I think normally I would ask you how you came to the film, but I think the answer is pretty recently.
Yeah. I saw it in preparation for this podcast for the first time yesterday afternoon, and as we're recording this, and it was quite an experience watching this movie, as you said, Steve, compared to watching having known the TV show. Like I had to really adjust my expectations for each of these characters, especially the Burns character with Robert Duvall's performance.
Oh, it's totally different.
And I don't even remember Cutter, I don't think, in the MASH show, and maybe you can enlighten me on that. But I was really surprised by some in the Trapper John stuff. And by the way, this is the first time it occurred to me that Trapper John MD is the same character that spun off from MASH and became that CBS procedural for such a long time. So just fascinating tentacles around this MASH whole thing.
Right.
But the film itself, it was an interesting experience, which of course we'll be talking about here on the show.
So for me, I have no idea when I first saw this movie. It is definitely one where I'm switching channels. And I watch MASH at 5 o'clock after school. I watched it. It was on 11 o'clock. I watched those episodes over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
In the same way as Star Trek, where I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen some of these episodes of MASH. But then I'm switching channels and I see the same location and a bunch of guys in green and someone named Hawkeye. And I watch like 15 minutes of it here and there. I don't think I actually, this weird thing of the way we grew up of like, you could have seen parts of a movie 10 times before you actually watched the whole thing from beginning to end.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So somewhere between the ages of 6 and 12, I think I had watched many of the pieces. And then somewhere junior high or high school, I actually watched the whole film. It's something like that.
Cool.
Before we get into pre-production, I would like to have a little bit of pre-production.
Okay.
Which is to talk a little bit about the world that this movie is coming into. And in particular, the biggest, most important movie about the Vietnam War, where this is the Vietnam War era, was made in 1968 by John Wayne, and that is The Green Berets.
That's right. The Green Berets.
2 years earlier than this film.
Can I tell you? That film won me a Schmoedown match.
Oh, really?
The Green Berets was the 5-point question in a match with me and Matt Nost versus Gray Drake and Matt Atchity from Rotten Tomatoes. And I pulled it out of my butt and it won me the match. But it has a special place in my heart. Plus, I love that song, the Green Beret song.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That is as American something or other of that era as you could possibly get.
Exactly.
So this is the split of the old Hollywood and the new Hollywood is happening at this moment. And then the other thing that I think is important to talk about is the book that came out, I think, in 1961, which is Catch-22.
Yeah.
I don't think MASH exists without Catch-22.
Good point.
And what's interesting is right at the same time as MASH is being shot, Mike Nichols on a Buck Henry script is filming this $17 million version of Catch-22. They are filming at the same time as MASH.
Yeah, with Orson Welles. And I think Richard Benjamin is the lead. Or Alan Arkin.
Alan Arkin, Art Garfunkel, Charles Grodin. Yes, Orson Welles, Bob Newhart, Martin Balsam. And this is a big, and it's so interesting because Nichols, who does The Graduate and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, is the Hollywood hot new director. And Hollywood, the establishment, has got behind making this totally anti-establishment film, which, spoiler alert, is not going to work. I've seen it once, and it just isn't. It is amazing how much talent goes to make something based on source material that is so funny and make it so unfunny and dry and boring.
It is not a good movie. I agree.
No. So that's the world that this is going into. And what happens is that blacklisted screenwriter Ring Lardner, who had written Woman of the Year and Laura, found this book by Richard Hooker, whose real name is H. Richard Hornberger, which is MASH, which I listened to it years ago, and I just listened to it again for this. It's totally fun. I like the book a lot, actually. And also, it's very much what's in the movie. And so there's all this discussion about, Ring Lardner wrote this script and developed this structure, and Altman improvised all over it and tossed Ring Lardner's script. And I'm looking at the book going, a lot of it was here, So like the idea that this was all just an improvised movie, I think is less true than people try to make it sound.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if that was true. There are some liberties that the movie takes that are different from the book, but certainly it's pretty much the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So Daryl Zanuck, who had been the head of, storied head of Fox Studios, was kind of off in Europe doing his own thing, and had his son Richard Zanuck later to produce untold numbers of great movies, including The Sting and Jaws. He reads the script, he likes it, and then they go out to all the directors. I'm just saying all of them, and all of them said no. They couldn't find anyone willing to direct this movie. They all saw it as just a disaster waiting to happen.
Wow.
And so finally they go to this very not a film director. Robert Altman is TV director, and this is our first film with him. So now I'm going to give you a little bit more biography, which is Altman. He's born in 1925. He had 5 Best Director nominations, a couple of other nominations for screenplay. He's a Midwestern guy, Kansas City, Missouri, joined the Air Force at 18, flew more than 50 bombing missions as a co-pilot of a B-24 Liberator against Japan. I mean, that's a serious war record.
Yeah, hell yeah, it is.
Yeah, came to Hollywood, immediately sold a script to RKO in 1948. Then nothing. Couldn't get a job anywhere in Hollywood. Goes back to Kansas City, starts making industrial films. The guy's directing plays at the Jewish Community Center. No respect to Jewish community centers. They're wonderful places, but like he's just going like he's working wherever he can work. Finally starts breaking into TV in the mid-50s, caught attention of Alfred Hitchcock, who saw something of his and hired him to work on Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
Nice.
Altman made it 2 episodes before being fired for differences with the producers. It seems like
working.
Yeah. Then he does tons of 50s and 60s TV, Bonanza, combat, craft, mystery theater. And the thing about him was he was a pain in the ass. He did not know how to hold his tongue. He could be very grumpy, but he got things shot under budget and on time.
Yeah.
And that's how you keep working, particularly in television. But he also wouldn't do what the network wanted. It was described like the description of him as a combative and argumentative cuss. That's how Altman's described. It's so funny. Like we've had so many directors. We've had directors who were bullies, directors who had massive egos, directors who were control freaks. It sounds to me, listening about Altman, Robert Altman doesn't give a fuck.
No.
That's really like he doesn't care.
Well, that's why he was in the perfect choice in retrospect for something like MASH. And you know what? And look, the fact that he was able to work for decades, being that way, as you said, speaks volumes to his abilities and what he got done.
And the other thing that's happening in all these years doing all this TV work is that he's working with all these actors who are coming up at the same time. He worked with guys like James Caan, Tom Skerritt, Bruce Dern, Robert Duvall. All of these people became part of his circle. And it sounds like, for the most part, and we'll get into some of the exceptions, actors love to work with Altman because he gives them tons of freedom and tons and respects and trusts them in lots of ways.
Well, we've talked about on the show many times, Steve, of course, about these directors and the explosion of the 70s, right? And it wasn't like all of a sudden directors just showed up on the shorelines of Hollywood like, we are now on tours, give us all the money. Things were changing through the 60s and their tastes were changing. Vietnam was happening, the protests in the streets. So there was a building resentment of the establishment of systemic stuff. And so you saw that here building through the 60s, and then boom, we get to the 70s. And not only do we get, filmmakers that have this auteur bent and the studios are willing to give money to these filmmakers who are shooting films in such interesting and unusual ways, but actors also come in who have, as Altman is, a bit of a cuss. They have a bit of an attitude, a bit of a belief in themselves, a bit of an FU to the establishment in their performances. So Altman was the right guy at the right time with all the right actors to be able to direct them in a number of movies throughout the 70s that were very anti-establishment or constantly questioning the genre of the movie that it is being a part of. So I love that about his history and about the actors that work with him. So you talk about him attracting these actors. He's attracting these actors probably because he's slightly older and they see him maybe as a bit of a hero or idol in that he's able to handle things in his way, and they're able to kind of do that by extension in their own careers, you know.
And it's funny too, because we tend to group him in with, he's one of those 70s directors, like, you know, Scorsese and Spielberg and Lucas and Coppola and Bogdanovich and Friedkin and all those guys, except he's almost a full generation older than all of them.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, right.
You know, is that he fought in World War II. You know, he didn't come up in the 60s. Like, and he was busting his ass doing television work while those guys were, you know, and Scorsese was off in New York and NYU, you know.
Yeah.
Very, very different. One other thing that's really important is that Fox was not making just one, not two, but 3 war movies at the same time. Simultaneously to shooting MASH, which had a $3.5 million budget, they were shooting Tora, 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 and Patton, both of which had massive budgets. And this is kind of an independent movie. So what Altman said is, he said, look, we're going to stay under budget, under the radar. We're going to be ahead of schedule, and we might just get away with this.
See, a good rebel who is smart. That's an essential thing in any rebellion. Yeah.
And it sounds like the set, it's funny because he's an anti-authoritarian in every single way, but he's also a guy with a temper. He's a mean drunk.
Yeah.
And so the set there was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of partying. But when they were shooting, everyone was very focused and worked hard. And then you knew that you were done for the day, because at the last shot of the day, Altman would turn to his prop guy and say, bring me a glass of Cutty Sark. And he'd get his scotch, and that would be the last shot of the day. So shall we get into the film?
Yeah, let's do it.
So it must have hit you so hard when that music hits and those helicopters are coming in.
Through early morning fog I see visions of the things to be.
But you know what? But it's darker. Seeing
it's dark,
right? Yep. That all of that, there's a different edge to it. Hearing the lyrics of the song, I'd forgotten, of course, that "Suicide is Painless" is the name of the theme song, and then hearing the lyrics made you like, wow. Like, especially nowadays, when we're much more aware of mental health, when we're speaking about it more openly, it's much more a part of the pop culture zeitgeist, as we saw with Inside Out 2. By the way, plug, if you didn't listen to our live discussion with Vogel over the weekend for Cine-Files Live, you should definitely listen to that episode. We talked about all these sequels. But like, that's kind of, it hit me right in the face. Like, oh, this is a different energy. You got to come meet the movie at its energy level. This is not the TV show, you know?
Well, and particularly because you said the lyrics, you listen to the lyrics and you go, wait, what are you saying? Like, are you serious? Like, is this what are you saying?
That suicide is painless. It brings on many changes, and I can take or leave it if I please.
I want to throw something in here that people should know about the song. It was written for Ken Primus, who sings the song in the movie during that Walter Painless Pole Waldowski ceremony, which we'll get to either in part 1 or part 2 of this breakdown, when he's dealing with the possibility that he may be a homosexual or not. But Robert Altman told Johnny Mandel, who was composing the music, and Michael Altman, who were doing the lyrics, that he wanted the song to be as stupid as possible. The stupidest song ever written, he said. And he wanted it to be called "Suicide is Painless." So he kind of came up with the title and then said it had to be the stupidest song ever written. And Altman attempted to write the lyrics himself, but he said it was too difficult for his 45-year-old brain to make something this stupid. So he gave the task to his 15-year-old son, Michael, who reportedly wrote the lyrics in 5 minutes. So Michael Altman, who is credited with the lyrics of this song, was 15 years old when he wrote it. And according to Altman legend, he wrote it in 5 minutes and wrote the stupidest song ever. So That's, we could dissect these lyrics, but if you wrote them in 5 minutes, how much thought was he really having behind these lyrics? So it's an interesting song. And I think the creation of the song, reflecting the madness of what's going on, it shows that Robert Altman's instincts were in the right place for making this movie, because what is more stupid than war? Really, what is more stupid than war? So why not make a song that is utterly the stupidest song ever written to reflect the opening of something that is ultimately stupid and costs so many lives,
I was going to save this comment for later, but it actually fits just perfectly now, which is one of the things that Altman said was people come to him and say, like, well, how do you feel about, the low sense of humor, potty humor, all the kind of silly sexual stuff in this movie? Are you embarrassed by that? He's like, absolutely not. Anything that it is low, it is stupid. Like, that's the whole point. In fact, the lower it was, the more we went for it. And what he said was, you might think these things are obscene, but the greatest obscenity is war.
Yeah.
Nothing comes close to the obscenity of war. So any stupid stuff we do is not, if you're offended by that and not offended by the war, that's the real problem.
And please, we want to make it very clear. It's not that fighting against the Nazis, fighting against Hitler was stupid. Not at all. It was that the fact that this person came into power at a time and used his power to abuse a situation to essentially force other countries to go to war with Germany. The idea of war actually needing to happen because someone came along. This is the stupidity of war,
Well, and as a person who has served, I'm sure you've been around situations that were FUBAR, like just because you're fighting for a righteous cause doesn't mean everything in the army is sensical or that war happens in a way that is, rational and it's chaotic and bizarre and crazy and mad,
Absolutely.
One of the other interesting things, by the way, as you're watching the credits, is you will see all of these names that say introducing next to them.
Yeah.
It's introducing Joanne Flood, Gary Berghoff, who plays Radar, John Schuck. These are people that become really known people. Fred Williamson has a huge career, obviously. Carl Gottlieb, who was with co-writer of Jaws. He also is Iron Balls McGinty in The Jerk.
Right.
Bud Cort, who goes on to Harold and Maude, who we just talked about in Pumping Iron.
Yeah.
And this is how this came about. And I find this fascinating, was Altman's an ensemble guy. I mean, to say Altman's an ensemble guy is like a vast understatement. And he didn't want extras. He wanted a cast of people, all of whom could act and carry a line and had a character and could be involved.
Yeah.
And he was in San Francisco and went to ACT, American Conservatory Theater, which I grew up going to see plays there, and sees all these interesting actors and basically just brings down a whole bunch of San Francisco actors. And here's what happened, which is, you will find this amazing and shocking, I think, which is normally in a movie, the producers are always going, we got to take away that person's line because I don't want to pay them as a SAG actor because it costs too much money.
Right.
Altman did the opposite. He went through the script and added one line for every one of these people that he brought from San Francisco so that they would get paid for as a SAG actor so that he could have them improvise in the movie.
That's awesome.
Isn't it?
That is a good thing to do. Hey, how do you get a crew of actors? You're good to actors. That's how you get a crew of actors to be part of your posse, man. That's great.
So they shot in Fox's backlot, which is, in the hills of Malibu. And part of the reason it's so kind of green and lush is that there had just been like a flood like a week or so before. We see people running up to the helicopters. They're grabbing these, as you said, very bloody bodies off of the treads of the helicopter. And immediately we're seeing the zoom lenses happen, listening to this crazy song. The camera is moving around in a way that we've never really seen before. It is dirty and scrappy, and things are moving really fast,
Yeah, you could argue that this is a film that really announced the 1970s filmmaking here in 1970. Like the way that the Altman shot this film and, doing a little bit of research and analysis, reading other people's analysis rather about the movie, that was something that people come back to and really try to get people to understand. Much like when people go back and watch Citizen Kane, you might not understand a lot of the movie making techniques that were used that were like beyond the word revolutionary at that time, which is why that film is revered in the ways that it is. I think when you look at MASH, there's a lot of what you called it, Steve, obviously as a director, like these are these things that separate it out or really announce it as a new form of filmmaking that we will see numerous times used these different methods throughout the 1970s, and of course for many years afterwards, up until today, in some ways as well.
We're gonna talk a lot about it because there is so much that changed filmmaking in this film.
Yeah.
And then we see Henry Blake and Radar, and we have the classic joke, which you'll see later on throughout the entire TV show, where he yells, "Radar!"
Yes, sir.
And of course, Radar, Gary Berghoff, is standing right next to him and says, "Yes, sir." By the way, here's how Gary Berghoff got cast, which is that, and he is the only person to carry through from the movie into the TV series. And Otto Preminger saw him in a production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, playing Charlie Brown on Broadway, which is perfect casting, And he tells his brother, Ingo Preminger, who is the agent for Dalton Trumbo and Ring Lardner Jr., and is the producer of this film. And that is how he gets cast as Radar. I don't think Gary Berghoff gets enough credit for being able to do the thing that he does in this movie and throughout the TV series. And one of them is just this talking while the other person is talking, because he already knows all the stuff he's supposed to do.
I put in a call into General Hammond and Saul. I hope he sends us those two new surgeons. We're sure going to need them.
What was that, sir? I give everything to Radar.
Yeah, it's so great. And again, this is something that I had to be like, okay, let me understand the pacing of this overall. And seeing Blake, played by the great Roger Bowen there, going back and forth with Radar and completely not having an issue with it.
Well, Colonel Blake is not in charge.
No,
in
any way, shape, or form.
Yep. And Radar is the person who knows and again, this is exactly what's in the book, that's described exactly this way in the book. And one of the things we do hear about is that there are these new surgeons that are going to come in because we need new surgeons. And we cut to, with extremely dramatic music, with swelling patriotic music, we see Donald Sutherland coming out of, if you look closely, the officer's latrine.
Yeah.
And it's a weird shot because he's walking towards camera with his duffel and all that stuff. Yeah. And there's something kind of out of focus in the foreground. It's a very messy, dirty shot. And then we have this scroll during this dramatic music that says, "And then there was Korea." I just love starting with, "and then there was." It's like, well, where were we before?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So Altman was totally against having this in the movie.
What?
Well, the reason is because this movie isn't about the Korean War. This movie is about the Vietnam War.
Right.
All Altman characters very anti-war. Everyone in the cast and crew was anti-war. Ring Lardner is anti-war. Yeah. Their main point was to make this like the Vietnam War. And so there are so few clues or mentions that this is actually not Vietnam. He wanted people to believe it was Vietnam, and the studio wanted nothing to do with Vietnam. They were like, no, this is about Korea. You have to very, very clearly state that this is about Korea. And I love that. And again, because Altman is so subversive, is that he goes, okay, fine. I will put text right up on screen explaining it's Korea. And while we have the dramatic words of the great General Douglas MacArthur going up on the screen, we're seeing a dude walk out of the latrine.
Again, subversion. So smart.
Totally.
And then we end with the one quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, "I'm going to Korea." Just says that very simply.
And then we see Hawkeye. He's showed up at a Jeep, and this African-American soldier comes up and stops him.
"Just because you're captain, don't think you run the joint."
Oh, come on.
I run it.
Yeah, all right. I'm just supposed to...
I know what you're supposed to do. Your driver will be with you shortly. He's having his coffee now.
And the moment, and again, this is the sense of humor of this movie.
Yeah.
Is that after he kind of berates Hawkeye about the Jeep, this guy walks away, and under his breath, Hawkeye says, "Racist." Here's again, I said that Robert Altman doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Neither does Hawkeye. Hawkeye doesn't care. Yeah. And then we see Tom Skerrit arrives, who had worked with Altman on Combat. He's on a Jeep with a bunch of nurses. He mentions the 4077 MASH, goes up to the Jeep, and just assumes that Hawkeye must be the driver.
Yeah, he's not wearing any rank. Why wouldn't he assume that he's the driver? And he's standing by the Jeep. Makes all the sense in the world.
Okay, let's go, boy. Get him out of the bag.
And I love, too, that he calls him boy.
Yeah.
And Hawkeye immediately, it's like a game of yes and. It's like improv.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And he jumps on and they head off. By the way, one of the things that's in the book that isn't so much in the movie is that Hawkeye is a Yankee and Duke is from Georgia. And so, and it's one of those stories of they instantly become best friends. You know, they overcome that right away. And of course, the guy who's in charge of the motor pool sees them, calls for the MPs. The MPs go out after him. They have a blowout, and then I love that this motor pool guy gets pissed off and he takes a swing at the MPs. I wrote down, the military.
Yes. And then he's the one that gets arrested.
Yep.
But it's a great intro, as you said, to Hawkeye and Cutter there. But also, because of course, him hitting on women or talking to women is going to be a massive deal in the movie. But the incompetence of the military, the incompetence of the people in charge, right? Having this guy be easily because he's disrespectful to Hawkeye right off the bat. And then Hawkeye is like, well, why do I have to respect you? If you're not going to be respectful to me, screw it. I'm taking off. And of course, the racist white joke is hilarious, but he also says it under his breath and with his back turned because he knows better. But when they jump into the Jeep and take off, just having the MPs and having it break down is just perfect. That just speaks volumes about how incompetent people in charge in the military can be sometimes, and their equipment.
So we pull into camp, and it's funny because it isn't exactly the set that we end up having in the TV show, but it's a lot of the same stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And we pull in, and what we see right away is that we're shooting like through the mess hall, through the tent flap, out at the Jeep. We're using these zoom lenses. So, you know, zoom lens, you can change the focal length and get much closer without moving the camera, which for a run and gun kind of style is a lot faster than setting up a dolly track and having to push a dolly through and all that stuff. They don't have to do any of that. They just have, we have these zoom lenses. And what's so interesting is that the zoom lens can go wherever it wants to go, you know, like, so Altman's just following the action as he sees it. And we're also shooting through all these fog filters, which gives everything this sort of misty look. He wanted to make sure all the clothes are dirty, the people are dirty, the surfaces are dirty, the tents are dirty. And at first, the studio, when they started to see dailies, are like, this is terrible. This looks like a mess. You got to clean all this up. And according to Altman, a month later, they're sending notes to the set of Patton saying you need to make everybody look dirty or they look too clean.
Wow.
Well, and I think, too, it's like, you remember when we did White Christmas? Yeah. So that's 15 years earlier than this, mid-50s, and we're in World War II, and it's like a movie set of World War II. Yeah. You know what I mean? All the clothes are this exact same color. Everybody looks... And that was sort of the Hollywood world was, everything was a little Hollywood. Everything was a little designed. And I think just in terms of production design and costume, this is why MASH and things like Last Picture Show and stuff like that are so influential. And the one that I went to is that everyone talks about the genius of George Lucas to create the lived-in world for Star Wars where people could be dirty and they weren't all in jumpsuits and stuff. Again, I go, look at MASH, you know? And I love, too, that Duke still doesn't see Hawkeye as, he just still thinks he's a driver. And he says, why don't you come and get me a sandwich? He says, I'll follow you anywhere, sir. And they head in and immediately spot who will become known as Lieutenant Dish, which is Joanne Flug.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Joanne Flug, I think there's some fascinating stuff with her. She acted quite a lot in the 60s or the 70s and 80s, and then she was a series regular for The Fall Guy. She was on Operation Petticoat for a season as well. But this is also what's fascinating about Joanne. She was the third Mrs. Chuck Woolery. That's right. Back in 2 and 2, Mr. Chuck Woolery there. They had a daughter and they were together for like 8 years. They divorced in 1980. And another thing about her is that she turned down the role that Bonnie Franklin played in One Day at a Time. She was going to be the mom of the two girls. And I thought for sure, and looking at it, that she was probably like really close to getting it here because they cast 2 brunette actresses to play her daughters, and with Valerie Bertinelli and Mackenzie Phillips. So the fact that they went with a redhead like Bonnie Franklin, I think, is a fascinating thing. And of course, I love the show, so it works either way. But she is someone who stopped acting around the mid-90s. Her last role is in the film The Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And she becomes this like motivational speaker for the rest of her time. She's still around, still alive, and did that. And she also became born again. And so that's just a fascinating, interesting thing about her as an actress. So she she went into a lot of directions in her life and has kind of found her path now a little bit later in life for herself as well. So a really good addition. And she said that she kind of became disenamored, if that's a word you can use, with the acting profession throughout the 80s and 70s because a lot of people reached out to her to do nudity, and eventually that was something that kind of turned her off about being an actress. So she went her own path, and I think she's a fun part of the movie. And I wish there was more, and apparently there is more of her, but they didn't use it in the film. So yeah.
No, I totally like Lieutenant Dish. Also, the name Lieutenant Dish is a great name too. Yeah, exactly. And one thing, and again, said a few minutes ago that for Altman and the cast and crew, this is all about Vietnam.
Yeah.
Lieutenant Dish's hair is a perfect example of how they're doing that, because that hairstyle is full 1970s.
Yeah.
That is not 1951. No one had that hairstyle in 1951. And so when you're watching the movie, if you missed the thing where it said, and then there was Korea, you're looking at it, it looks like today. It looks like Vietnam. And Duke comes in, and again, this is how the camera is going to work, which is we're in this zoom lens, and it zooms in with him, following him as he goes to get silverware and whatever. And then the zoom lens backs up and picks up Henry and some other people sitting at one of the tables. So the camera is sort of roving, zooming in on one thing and then pulling back to reveal other things. That's not how movies were made in the classic sense. Henry Blake is noticing these new guys. They don't know who they are. And thinks that they're just, because neither of them look like officers, that they're just guys that, wandered in off the front. And of course, what is Duke doing but sitting down with Lieutenant Dish?
Trying to hit on her and look, invading her space. Again, this is one of those moments where I was watching it and felt, through 2024, I slightly uncomfortable, because he is absolutely sitting down. She's calmly having a fun conversation with the other nurses or the ladies who are there, the other women who are serving, the other enlisted officers who are serving, who are female. But Duke, who needs to have his needs met in that moment, interrupts loudly twice, because she ignores him the first time, then interrupts, Lieutenant, I don't have any plans, to try to get her attention. And even Hawkeye moves her over so that he can sit next to her as well, and he begins a little bit of the seduction game. So the film has issues with women for sure, and I will highlight them as we go along. So just warning you all who are listening, I will try not to be obviously too crazy about it, but certainly there are issues within this film where they have issues with women and how they're treating women in this film for sure.
So the reason I'm so happy that we've gotten to MASH is that I actually think it can illustrate a point about this. Obviously, this has been an ongoing conversation since the beginning of the Cine-Files of how did we do stuff then? How might we do stuff different here?
Yeah.
If you watch the TV series, it's the same. Yeah. Hawkeye, one of the most beloved characters, Alan Alda, icon of liberalness.
Yes.
He is sexually harassing nurses, including hot lips, throughout the entire series. It is a constant thing. And the reality is we, the audience at that time in the early 70s, thought that was hilarious. And and this is the thing that I think is interesting. And I don't think that anyone would say that stuff wasn't going on in an army hospital. Of course, it absolutely was. And if you listen to women of that era or of any era, this era, whatever, they say, that shit goes on all the time.
Yeah.
If you watch Mad Men, you will watch exactly the same behaviors. And so it's not that we're saying you can't show this behavior, except the big difference, it ain't funny in Mad Men.
And the women have conversations about the experiences with these men in Mad Men, and they don't have that in a lot of these movies and TV shows where that stuff was happening, right? Because that would have been ground. I mean, I think Mary Tyler Moore was one of the first shows to come along in the 70s, kind of really expose that and show how the way men speak to women is not the way things should go in an equal world. So
and this is why it's like the argument the discussion you and I have been having isn't about, I'm not saying, MASH is bad because it did these things. It's like, no, that was the world at this time.
Yeah.
But if you compare MASH to Mad Men, you can see how the world of filmmaking has changed.
Yeah.
Is that you go like, we're not going to go for that particular joke because we've learned things about how it feels to be one of those nurses that we maybe wouldn't find that so funny right now.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I can still be amused by watching this movie from this world at this time, and also have part of my brain go, it feels a little uncomfortable,
Yeah, it feels a little icky. For sure.
Just enjoying that lovely dish there.
Captain, you are speaking about a lieutenant in the United States Army. I'm Colonel Blake.
Oh, Colonel. Yeah. I'm Duke Forrest, new cutter. That's my driver over here.
Captain Hawkeye Pierce.
I love Donald Sutherland's whistle.
Yeah.
That whistle's so great.
Henry Blake is played by Roger Bowen, who, I don't know if you know this, Steve, he is the co-founder of Second City.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. Well, he was writing, he's a prolific writer. He said he called himself a writer who moonlighted as an actor. And he was writing theater reviews for the Chicago Maroon at the time. And he was asked to pen material for an improvisational troupe that included Alan Arkin and someone who just talked about earlier, Mike Nichols. And the troupe was the Compass Players, and they evolved into becoming Second City. So he's the co-founder of Second City there. And here's an interesting thing too about him. He died of a heart attack one day after McLean Stevenson died of a heart attack, who also played Blake on the MASH TV series in 1996. Both of them died within one day of each other. His family, Roger Bowen's family, didn't want to take away from McLean Stevenson's death, so they waited a whole week before they announced his death, Roger Bowen.
Wow.
So that's fascinating. The Blakes died within one day of each other in the same year. Crazy. Of a heart attack, both of them too. Crazy.
That's crazy.
Captain Hawkeye Pierce, I had a twix about you. It seems that you stole a Jeep up at headquarters.
No, sir. No, I didn't steal a Jeep. No, it's right outside, right there.
Oh, so it is.
I love that explanation. And then we get a whole bunch of introductions, including Father Mulcahy, which is Rene Auberjonois.
Yeah. Who played?
He played, he was on Benson. And
yeah,
then he played, right. I just drew a blank of his name on Deep Space Nine. It's Odo. Odo is the character on Deep Space Nine. He's a fantastic actor, and I think he's fantastic in this. And it's weird, this is one where it's weird because, okay, that's not my Father Mulcahy,
Yeah, I know. It's an interesting approach, and I love him as an actor. So to see him pop up in this, I think was great. And there are a number of introductions, as you said, throughout. And of course, that's where we meet Gottlieb, right? Who co-wrote Jaws. We see him in that introduction as well. And then we do meet John Schuck, Captain Painless Waldowski. And of course, we know him, Steve, as the Klingon ambassador in Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 6. And he played Henry Munster for years on the Munsters Today show that was, I think, the late 80s, early 90s when that show was around. So a very distinct face. And of course, we'll see him later when he tries to commit suicide.
Yeah. And of course, we have another call for Radar, who's again right next to us. But by the way, so long lenses tend to compress space. So the long lenses totally help this gag work better because it feels like Radar's like right on top of him.
Yeah.
And of course, Radar already knows that he's going to put them in Major Burns' tent. Again, it's Radar being ahead of things because he turns to Hawkeye and Duke and says,
"Gentlemen, I'm Corporal O'Reilly. They call me Radar. You'll be staying with Major Burns' tent. I'll take your things over there now. Don't worry about the Jeep. I'll change the numbers."
Oh, and change the numbers on that Jeep.
Which I love because what's having not just Radar assume we're going to change the numbers on the stolen Jeep, but Henry also is that it's, we don't care about the Army authority. You know what I mean? We already know that we're operating outside the rules to some degree,
Yeah, because he seems unbothered by the fact that they've been drinking all day. Blake does. Yep. He seems unbothered by it all. And I guess it's our first glimpse, because for me as a military man watching this, I'm like, what are you doing? You can't, what? They're drinking and they're going to perform surgery, or they might have to operate on people. What are you doing? But of course, this is the whole point of the movie, that the madness of the front line, because they keep reiterating how close they are to the front line, means that all those other ways of operating from farther back from the front line really don't apply here, because the madness of it all would just drive you even crazier if you had to be regimented in your approach to everything.
One of the things I think that the movie does well, but the book does better, is that what you will see is that these characters will do something horrible and reprehensible. They just go, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. But then you will see how awesome they are and how many lives they save and how dedicated they are to saving lives or doing a really good thing. And so it goes back and forth in this, and it's just, it's like it's funny. It's Mike Nichols is that years ago we talked about the very beginning of the podcast in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is that you have to keep that couple from leaving. Is that horrible things can happen and they can be angry and they can be about to go, but they can't leave. Right. Is that the level of horribleness that we see from these characters in this film, they have to be just far enough and then get redeemed so we don't turn on them. You know?
Yeah, good point.
That's kind of the key. And then we head up to what is the swamp. It's, just like in the TV show. And as we go, we hear this voice saying,
Valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
and we go inside and see Major Burns, which is Robert Duvall.
I had no idea he was in this movie. Absolutely zero. And when he popped up as Burns, I'm like, Burns? Duvall? And so, again, my mindset from the TV show having to be put aside so I can understand why he would be cast in this role in this movie.
Well, and it's so because Frank Burns in the TV show, Larry Linville, it's ferret face. He's ineffectual. He can be nasty and he can be mean spirited.
Sure.
But there's something weak about that Frank Burns.
Right. It's toothless.
Yeah. Whereas Duvall he can't be weak exactly.
No, he's never. No.
And
Bill Radley, when he didn't speak, he was scary as hell. So
yeah. There is a power that he walks around with. And we also meet Ho-Jon. And it was funny. There was a Korean scholar on one of the bonus materials of all the stuff that I'd watched. And that, MASH had been his favorite show growing up. And the one thing he did say, though, he was like, this is the only Korean character in the movie. And Ho-Jon is not a Korean name. There's nothing Korean about this at all.
This is Ho-Jon. He's one of our mess hall boys. I'm teaching him how to read.
Oh, is that right? Reading the Bible, huh? Oh, that's nice. Listen, I tell you what, I got a book here. It's got a lot of pictures in it, and I think it's easier to learn how to read when you look at pictures. Little adventure pictures.
And he hands him a dirty magazine.
And he says, can I leave now, Mr. Burns? Captain Burns? So, yeah. By the way, this was Kim Atwood. This was the only thing he ever did.
Wow.
As Ho-Jon, the only thing he ever did. I couldn't find any other information on him. I looked all over the internet. So he's living some blissful life somewhere, but this was the only film he ever did. And he's memorable in this film. So much so that this character, I think, was in the first couple of seasons of MASH, and they eventually phased him out. Yeah.
And then we're just in this moment and it's funny. And then you have this very hard cut right into the middle of surgery. The camera moves through this space and it is bloody.
Yeah.
Very, very different from the TV show, obviously. This is what Altman wanted. He was like, no, this is the way it was. They had a technical advisor who had served on MASH units in the Korean War. Yeah. They are doing what was called throughout this movie and through the series, meatball surgery. Like, it's like, get it done quickly. And what you hear is, which I've heard about surgeons forever, which is that there is a sense of humor. There's a gallows humor that goes on in the surgery, and that we're not shying away from any of that.
Yeah, there's a gallows humor when you're dealing with death in anything, right? There's gallows humor in the military when you're at war. There's gallows humor for people who work in a morgue or in a coroner's office. And there's gallows humor here because that's the only way you get through this really unsettling and insane situation. All these bodies coming through from war that you have to work on.
And the key moment to me, I think, and it's what part endears you to these guys, is that Hawkeye goes,
Nurse, you got a clamp, please?
Yes, sir. Why don't you use this little,
Scratch my nose.
Because it makes them human, you know?
Right. And it distracts them from the madness of it all. Yeah.
And then we hear, and these will happen throughout the whole movie.
Attention, all non-commissioned, attention. All non-commissioned officers will report for short arm inspection at 0400. That is all.
So here's how this happened.
Yeah.
So one thing we should say about this movie, this is an episodic movie. This is not a movie where there is a character conflict and a goal and obstacles, and then things at the end of the second act take a turn for the worse, and then we have to recover and fight back in order to have an ending where we either achieve or don't achieve our goal. That is not this movie.
Right.
This is just a bunch of stuff that happens.
Yeah.
And it's just going to go to random little sequences of stuff. Yeah. And what they realized in editing was that nothing was hanging together. Like, it looked like just a bunch, and they needed a technique to bridge the gaps between these moments. And they came up with this idea of this PA announcements, which all were added in post. And so they ended up, and they literally went to a whole bunch of old Army memos. Most of these, they're just reading off of old Army memos from the Korean War about movies that are being played and venereal disease tests and, demonstrations in surgery or whatever they are. And then they sent, because they're done shooting.
Yeah.
they sent this, the sets were still up in the Fox backlot. So they secretly sent like an assistant cameraman with a camera back to the set to guerrilla shoot all of those shots of zooming in on those speakers so they could have something to cut to when they did all this stuff.
Why would you? I mean, if you can hear it, why do you need to? That's such an interesting decision to do that for.
Because you got to, well, I can tell you exactly why. Because I need a neutral thing to cut to bridge the gap between the two scenes. And so I just want a thing. And because the nice thing about it is nobody's looking at it. So you're never crossing the line. You can cut to it from any scene ever to one of these speakers and then cut anywhere else. And that erases in your brain where you were before. It's like a very classic editing technique of I just need whereas if I cut straight from the middle of one scene into the middle of another scene, even with the audio, you're going to be a little jarred out of it, you know? And now we're back at the swamp. And now Ho-John is pouring martinis.
What's that?
That's Martin Eye, Frank.
Fine as kind. I'm training Ho-John to be a bartender. Would you care to imbibe, sir?
I love the way Hawkeye talks.
I don't drink.
Jesus Christ, I think he means it.
I think we've been had, Hawkeye.
I think you're right, babe.
Obviously, this is an anti-establishment movie.
Yeah,
and one of the establishments that we are attacking in this movie is religion.
Yes. Through Mulcahy and through Burns.
Yeah.
Really, yeah.
Well, it's like Mulcahy is this sort of bumbling character who we genuinely like that represents religion. Yeah. And Frank Burns is this kind of dark, scary guy who's very intense about his religion.
He's abusing religion, whereas Mulcahy is trying to bring, like, how can I say this? Do the right thing by religion by having a softer touch and adhering to the tenets of it. Burns is using it to lord it over people. I mean, just the way he's controlling Ho-John by making him read the Bible, he starts him on something like that because he's trying to essentially, and I imagine that's a symbolism of what a lot of missionaries do, bringing their religion to other countries to force them to worship their God, you know? And so you see that under the guise of saving them, whatever that means. So you see that essentially a colonization is what Burns is doing when he's teaching Ho-John to read the Bible. That's how he's teaching him to read, is to read the Bible, is colonizing him to the American way of doing things, you know?
Well, and one could find an objection to the alternative, which is, I'm going to give you pornography and alcohol, which is what Hawkeye and Duke do. You know, which is, but there is a certain level, and it's much more so in the book, that they treat Ho-John with respect in a way that Frank Burns does not.
Yeah.
You know,
for sure.
Because they like pornography and alcohol, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
And Frank goes down on his knees to pray and starts doing an Our Father, and they're watching him just like, what the hell is going on?
You ever catch this syndrome before, babe?
Give us this day our daily bread. No, not with anyone beyond the age of 8 years old, I haven't.
And he keeps praying, and then they think he finishes, and we get a little...
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
And they turn back to their drinks, and then Frank Burns prays some more.
Frank, were you on this religious kick at home, or did you crack up over here?
That was a great question.
Because it's implied, obviously you know this, you would bring it up, but implied in the question is you've obviously cracked up.
Yeah, that's already established. But when did it happen? Yeah.
Frank, how long does this show go on?
It gets longer all the time. Now I have your soul to pray for and Captain Pierce's.
So... I have two entirely... This is what's interesting about this movie to me, is, and particularly as I've grown older, and I have seen this movie many times, but is I have two different thoughts. One is I hate Frank Burns.
Sure.
I hate his arrogant, imposing his will on other people. I hate the martyr syndrome that he has and that he's put upon. But then I feel bad for him too, you know, because these two guys come into his tent and are instantly just ridiculing him and disrespecting him right from the beginning, while he in his mind is praying for them. I mean, looking at your face, I see that you're not Team Frank Burns, and neither am I.
No, I know you're not. But I think he's just supposed to represent the American establishment of the 50s and 60s, the mom and dads who made you, read you better go to church, you better wear your best suit. You're going to church on Sundays. You're going to listen to this stuff. Ignore what I'm doing on the side. Ignore how I'm violating certain things. Ignore how I'm violating the tenets of religion. in how I'm living my life. You better go and go. So you better go and go to church, and you better listen, and you better read the Bible. It's this hypocrisy, and as you said, they take shots at religion, and certainly having the one character who is overt about his religion, as opposed to Father Mulcahy, who's very much practicing it when it needs to practice it, which is giving last rites and what have you, or being there for counsel. Burns is using it to essentially make himself superior. And as we see later, when he blames Bud Cort for the death of one of the patients there, and we find out this is a pattern with him, that he's a person who uses religion in the wrong way. Yep. And I guess I would believe this is a commentary on a number of people from that generation who are the fathers and mothers of the rebellious actors from the 70s and filmmakers from the 70s who had to grow up in that environment. So him representing that, I think makes so much sense. Plus, Robert Duvall always radiates older dad, no matter how young he is. You know, and so I think that's why I don't have any sympathy for this guy. Hot Lips, I do. Burn, I don't, because I think he brings it on himself. You know.
And what is their response? I love that, again, it's that improv sort of yes and, which is that, so they go, oh, we're praying now? And so Hawkeye starts a chorus of Onward Christian Soldiers. And I love, and this is why you hire a troupe of great actors from the theater, because there's just these people walking by, and Hawkeye sings Onward Christian Soldiers, and they join in, create a procession, and now we have this Onward Christian Soldiers processional as Frank Burns struggles to continue on his prayers.
It's a controversial song, Onward Christian Soldiers, right? I mean, how can we be advocating the church? How can the God and the religion be advocating for these people to go and murder and kill God's creatures? You know.
And what are we in the middle of? We're in a movie about the obscenity of war.
Exactly.
You know, so it all fits perfectly. We are at a shot of tying up some bait, like a fly fishing bait. And I love that it's Colonel Blake with this nurse that we're going to see with him a lot, who's handing him his tools, just like you would to a surgeon as he ties this thing up. And in barge Duke and Hawkeye.
Henry, you've got to do something. We have stuck it out for a whole week now.
What is it, man?
That sky pilot, you have got to get him out of our tent.
Your tent?
Yeah.
I love that. It's like they get put in Frank Burns' tent. They manage to barely tolerate it for a week, and then they're like, you got to kick this guy out. And Blake sees through them. He knows they're trying to manipulate him. He's not going to have any of it. Obviously, they're not going to get away with any of this stuff, John.
Or so you think.
I've been in the Army a long time. I know what you guys are trying to pull, but you're not going to push me around.
Oh, no, Henry, not for the world would I push you around, but look, there is one more thing now that you're talking about it. We need a chest cutter.
Yeah, we got to get an A1 chest cutter in here quick, Henry. We're going to be in a hell of a lot of trouble.
And then, again, we do this intercutting and pre-lap where Radar says there's a lot of wounded, and so now we cut into pre-op and we see these guys looking at these new patients that came in as we continue to hear the conversation with Henry.
Henry, there's just one more thing.
I told you Major Burns will be out of your tent in 24 hours.
The chest cutter.
No. I'll try, damn it. You can't ask any more than that.
We're back in surgery, and there we see Father Mulcahy as he's, kissing the vestment stole or whatever it is, and they call him over to an operating table. And one thing we should say is, well, I think of him as Father Mulcahy because that's what's in the TV show.
Yeah.
That's not the name they call him in this movie. The name they call him is Dago Red.
Dago Red. Yeah.
And so the term Dago is a disrespectful term for Italians.
Yes.
My understanding of where this came from is not actually is that there is actually a wine called Dago Red, and that is what his nickname came from.
And it's because he's probably serving that wine at mass or whatever.
Yeah, right? Something like that.
Right.
But I don't like saying the name Dago Red.
I want to hear your reasoning for Spear Chucker when we get there. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I could. We'll certainly get there.
Well, at some point.
And so Duke calls him over to his table, because he was giving the last rites.
I'm sorry, Dago, but this man's still alive and that other man is dead, and that's a fact.
Yeah. That's a strong moment in the movie.
Yeah.
Right? Like the acceptance of the situation. I see you fawning over the dead body, and I know you want to respect that, but there are people who are trying to live here. So help us with this body first. That body can wait, sadly.
Well, and this is why, after seeing them manipulate Henry Blake and maybe not being so nice to Frank Burns, that you go, no, when they're in surgery, they are saving lives.
Yep.
That's it.
Absolutely their focus. Yes.
We're outside and we see Ho-John. He's looking around I love that he runs up to, I think his name's Bowen or something. He's like kind of the number 2 under Henry or something like that.
Sergeant, you know where Hawkeye is? I mean, Captain Pierce? No, I'd have to look at the duty roster.
Because everyone calls him Hawkeye, you know, because his name is Hawkeye.
Which you'll tell Hot Lips later.
There's sort of a gesture to this door, and there is Hawkeye with Lieutenant Dish. This scene, I think, is easily, you could see Alan Alda doing. It's so like there's so many affairs and him manipulating women to sleep with him in the TV show.
See, I made a vow to myself that while I was gone, I was going to be faithful to my husband.
Those are the vows you make when you're with somebody.
Look, I mean, there is a cynical point of view to have, and there are certain scenes in the movie where I think we will have a bit of more of a harder commentary to make, but this is, this happens. And they're both clearly in a consensual moment, having a playful, flirty back and forth about how far they can get one or the other to go in this situation. And so, and that happens. I've been in many situations like that where you are just kind of, you both know this might be wrong, but you're going to play around with it until you get to that moment where you finally convince one or the other to do it. So.
Well, Shakespeare says that we're supposed to hold the mirror up to nature and going like, oh, there's all this stuff that we're never going to make movies about this or talk about this because we feel like that they might make us uncomfortable or that people shouldn't behave that way. It's like people behave that way.
Yeah, people behave that way. For sure.
People 7,000 miles away in the middle of a war zone have affairs,
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
That is what it is.
Yep.
And they have like flirty little fun things like this where they're kind of pushing each other a little bit or playing with each other a little bit.
But again, it's also when you look at what Pierce says here, right? That's what you say when you're with someone, right? Which is fun and playful and, him trying to work his way into having sex with her and what have you. And she's letting him and it's all consensual, as I've said. But it's also showing you that like when you're close to the pit of madness, which war is, your principles, your morals, your ethics, all this stuff gets really kind of jumbled up and thrown in the air because there's a lot that's being asked of you emotionally and mentally to deal with this kind of stuff, So trying to put your peacetime back at home morality and mentality on them and judge them harshly, I think is unfair. Feel free to judge them because, of course, they both claim to have partners that they're married to. But overall, it's just showing you how maddening the situation is and how people adapt to this maddening situation.
It's funny, as you know, I'm always going to put things up on sort of a moral scale and go, is this right? That's how my brain works. Those are the questions I'm going to ask.
Yeah.
But that's not the only valid question to be asking.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's an important question, but it's like, is this true? Is it entertaining? Is it funny? Are the characters acting in a way that's true to themselves? All those things are important, and all those things are happening. But needless to say, they're not going to violate any of their vows because Ho-John is knocking on the door because Duke says they've got a new chest cutter in the swamp. And they go outside and we hear, and again, I just picturing you watching this movie for the first time when Radio Tokyo comes up and we hear Tokyo's Shoeshine Boy.
Yeah, this is an issue. I mean, not only does the film have a woman problem, it certainly has a race problem. And certainly turning Ho-John into essentially this fetch-it person. And then you have the Japanese coming over the intercom and the stereotypical racist Japanese accent as they're speaking English. And then even some of the song titles and some of the songs and the lyrics within the songs are quite uncomfortable. So yeah, I really hate it. And
did you hate it because all these same songs are in the TV show?
Yeah. I don't recall being as offended by it because I was a kid when I watched the TV show, right? I was in my 10, 12, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old type of thing. I wasn't as aware of these things as I am now, and so when I hear it in the movie, I really don't like any of these interludes with the Japanese voiceover announcer. And I know it's supposed to symbolize Vietnam, right? Because essentially I forget what her name was, the woman that they had there who was constantly saying negative things about soldiers, the Vietnamese woman over the intercoms, and they would play it in war. And we have it in Apocalypse Now as well. So she's meant to mirror that, right? It's meant to mirror that, but I still don't like it.
It's so funny because I asked the question because that was not what I expected. Because what I asked the question about was just because for me, every time I hear those songs, I'm brought to the TV series because they're used over and over and over and over again. These same songs, which I think were conditioned by Johnny Mandel, the composer.
Yeah.
I don't think these originals, but to me, I don't have that reaction because these were songs. First of all, Japan was an ally. This isn't the like I'm trying to mess with Americans by saying nasty things about them. And they really were broadcasting at this time. And, they really were picking up these shows. So like, to me, it doesn't bother me because people have accents and they were broadcasting it. So I never framed it as a racist thing. I understand why that's the way you see it, but that wasn't how I saw it.
The L's are played for R's and they're overtly played for R's in the approach. And you can't deny that it's, a white director, white screenwriter, majority white cast. So, why would they pick it up? And the 1970s, it's only been recently that it's been a big thing to highlight the anti-Asian sentiment in white comedy. Right. And Tina Fey has been subject to it. A number of really revered comedians have had some of their shows or products looked at and reanalyzed because of this anti-Asian sentiment. And when you watch, but like we did, Be Like Water, the Bruce Lee documentary, which we did a fun review on, that's something they speak about, how the Asian people are seen as the safe minority, so they're easy. White comedians have felt that they could make fun of them and not have necessarily a huge pushback. So,
well, and as you said, the only actual Korean character is Ho-Jon.
Yeah, right.
And we meet a doctor.
Not even a Korean name.
So, not even a Korean name. So I think it's a valid criticism. I never had that reaction, but I do see the point. Anyway, there's another little bit as Hawkeye leaves, and then Lieutenant Dish comes out just after buttoning herself up. And I was like, oh, there really are no secrets in MASH. Like everybody knows what everybody's doing. Yeah. And I'm not exactly sure what article of clothing she drops that Father Mulcahy ends up picking up. Maybe some drawers or something, but he has like oh my God, what did I grab? And then goes back to his Bible.
Yeah, I just wonder if it's the blanket they were messing around on, but I don't know. I can't tell. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we go into the swamp. This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. We go in. First thing we see is that this person who we haven't quite seen yet is putting up pictures of his kids, and right behind the pictures of the kids are naked pictures of women.
Hiya. I'm Hawkeye Pierce.
And this guy in this huge parka, Elliot Gould, waves.
One of the greats, Elliot Gould.
Yeah.
One of the greats.
He's just, I love him. And this is after, I know, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, which is certainly an interesting film. And that's where his sort of King's fame is. And Duke's trying to figure out who this guy is. And he says,
so all I can get out of him is he's from Baston and he'd been in the Army 2 months.
The way that Elliot Gould avoids answering questions is so great.
Well, listen, where were you when you were drafted?
Back home, I told you before.
No, I mean, what were you doing? Were you like a resident or on staff someplace?
He just goes, And he's trying to get answers. And Duke says, is there some reason where I shouldn't know the hospital? And Sutherland, in a way that only Donald Sutherland can do, says,
I don't know. I will ask. Is there some reason my friend should not know the name of the hospital?
Again, no answer.
There doesn't appear to be any reason. I've seen you somewhere before. I don't know your name, stranger, but your face is familiar.
And then they offer him a martini.
I'd love a martini.
Oh, John, give the gentleman a martini. I think you will find these accommodating. They're quite dry.
And then Elliot Gould, who we don't yet know is Trapper John, says,
don't you use olives?
Olives? Where the hell do you think you are, man?
We do have to make certain concessions to the war. We're 3 miles from the front line. And...
yes, but a man can't really savor his martini without an olive, you know?
And Elliot Gould reaches into his parka, pulls out a jar of olives, opens ones up, and the reaction from Hawkeye is so great.
He's immediately on board with Trapper John. Yeah.
He's like, oh, this guy, because it's a moment of, oh, he's one of us.
Yes, yes.
And by the way, the shot, he's holding the olive above the martini glass and he drops it and the camera goes down with the olive. That's really hard to do.
Yeah.
And you could see that the camera move isn't quite perfectly in sync because you have to have a good signal with the actor of like the 3, 2, 1 when I'm going to let go.
Yeah.
Because that camera has to be ready to move as soon as you let go of the olive. It's genuinely hard.
Yeah.
And then we cut from that to being like, oh, he's one of us, to surgery where he's teaching them how to do chest surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole bunch of people gathered around to watch because obviously this is very impressive surgery. And again, it's bloody and it feels very real. And then again, these are the jokes. And these are the jokes both in this movie and these are the jokes in the early days of MASH, of the TV show.
You just turn it around.
It's a good thing you have a nice body, nurse. Otherwise, we get rid of you quick.
That's the classic kind of joke that, the first 6 years of MASH had throughout the series. That's just, these are the jokes, I do love, by the way, when you get where they're talking about whether or not we should have big sutures or small sutures. And he says,
anybody know if this is an officer or an enlisted man?
He's an enlisted man.
Make the stitches big.
That's how it is, damn it.
Yep.
Enlisted versus officers. Always
it's one of the most bizarre divisions we've created because it mirrors like old British class structure. Like there are these officers.
Yeah.
And they're like a separate breed from ordinary non-coms,
It's the elitism. And
Totally.
that's why, enlisted men like I was love to fuck with officers and love to talk shit about them for sure. The ones that are
and it's also why Hawkeye, all these guys, they don't fall into the role of being the officers. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly.
It's after the surgery. We're outside. We're hearing another announcement from the PA system, and we see a little touch football game going on, and Trapper gets the ball, sends Hawkeye out for a pass, who catches it, and then Hawkeye has a reaction.
Did I ever tell you how Androscoggin College beat Dartmouth in a raging blizzard 6-0 because I intercepted a pass?
Yeah, you told
They had this great passer, see?
And the big smile comes over Trapper John, and he says,
How is Trapper John?
I thought you'd never remember.
Well, the thing to understand too about this film, and of course this is what they yell at, I think, Hot Lips later on in the movie, is these guys were drafted into this, right?
Yeah.
They're not people who signed up and wanted to serve their country and, went through the basic training and they have these stars and stripes and banners in their eyes of defending America. For them, they were taken out of something they were doing successfully in the civilian world and yanked into this theater of war in order to do what they were doing to help American soldiers who were hurt by the battles that were happening, irregardless of whether they agreed with the war or not, right? And so that's what makes them unusual when you look at this film, and you have to see it through that prism. These are not people who signed, or some of them are not people who signed up because they have some starry-eyed idea about defending the country. It's quite the opposite, and so that's why they have to be so irreverent, and that's where most of the humor comes from.
well, and the thing too is these guys are in their mid-20s.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, like, think of where you were in your mid-20s. Like
these
are
shit.
Yeah, I mean, these are young guys.
Mm-hmm.
And after we have this reunion, and I always go like, well, how long has it been since Trapper showed up with the jar of olives to when his name finally gets revealed that he's just been playing this close to the vest? Like, how long did he commit to this bit? I think it was for a couple of days at least.
Yeah.
And then we see this crowd gathered around the shower tent.
Oh, well, it must be painless Polish day in the shower tent.
Yeah, sir.
Painless Polish day in the shower tent.
Paul Wadowski, the dentist, you met him.
Well, what are those guys waiting to scrub his back or
No,
something?
he's what you might call the best equipped dentist in the Army.
You might call.
And then we see guys coming away from the tent, including Bud Cort, and the other guy says,
Oh, man, I'd surely love to see that angry.
and he's just stunned.
Yeah, man, listen, how can I say this correctly? There is a very interesting undercurrent of straight dudes doing homosexual things in the military. And certainly a bunch of dudes lined up to stare at another guy's large penis I think, qualifies. So it's a very interesting thing. I don't know if you had this growing up with any experience you had with a bunch of dudes, Steve, but guys like to sometimes piss on each other in the showers in the military, and other times, like, I don't know, just wrestle really hard, sometimes naked. I've seen that in the military, two dudes naked wrestling in the barracks. So it's very strange what happens in the military when dudes are around each other. So, because it's supposed to be this toxic masculine place, but there is very much an undercurrent of what I would argue is, would look like homosexuality from the outside world.
There is very little that I would think that young men would not get up to, given, in an enclosed space under a lot of pressure, they're going to do all sorts of wacky stuff. And you ask if I've had any experience like this. Not only do I have one, but this is actually, I will now tell you, never told this on the Cine-Files before. Here we go. The origin of, I believe, my first original joke. Would you like to hear it?
Please.
So, like a lot of young Jewish kids, I did a trip to Israel when I was 15 or 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're with 40 other kids from my temple, and we're touring around Israel. And I swear to God, this is exactly true, is that the lead tour guide, counselor, whatever dude, who was a South African gentleman, and I cannot remember his name at this moment, we were at, again, I swear, at the Dead Sea. We were at the Dead Sea, covered in salt, all went to go take showers at the public shower thing. Yeah. Julian, his name was Julian. And guys, it was just like this. Guys came out of the shower and said, "Did you see Julian?" They're like, "What?" And so all of the 15-year-old boys shuffled, through the shower to take a look. And it was like painless. It was that he was the most well-equipped man touring the young Jews around Israel. And here is the first joke I ever came up with. As I said, now I know what it means by a schlong. I mean, I don't have a schlong. It's not a schlittle, definitely. It's not a schlittle. It's more like a schlemidium. Maybe it's kind of schlavrage. That is the first joke I ever came up with.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, ladies and gentlemen. Wow.
Needless to say, the career in comedy never really appeared for me. Then a helicopter comes in, and we have a bunch of people, including Henry Blake, waiting, and there it lands, and out comes Major Hot Lips Houlihan, not named Hot Lips yet, Sally Kellerman. And by the way, she stands up to salute underneath that rotor, and I know she's a few feet away, but that scares the crap out of me.
Yeah, it does. It does. I'm imagining this was on purpose to have her skirt fly up so you could see her bumper. Yeah. It's on purpose to turn her into a sexual object.
Well, and it's funny. Her character, it's odd. And because she's kind of goofy and comedic in moments like this. And yet then she's also serious and regular army. And then her character goes through a turn later in the movie, and it's bizarre,
Yes. Well, and she's the most troublesome character in the film. And I don't mean troublesome in the performance. I mean in how they
treat her.
Yeah, how they treat her and how they portray her, right? Because as you said, you can understand she is essentially coming in to be the female Frank Burns, because she comes in very rigid. There are rules, there are ways. So she's the school marm in essence, is what they're playing her as. But by showing her being, awkward or goofy or clumsy, or the skirt flying up, you're already presenting her in a disrespectful way. So you already have her attempts at authority or attempts at calling these guys out for the shit they're pulling, which she has every right to do. You're already undercutting whatever power she might have in these situations by presenting her in this way.
Well, and this is where I go to, it isn't, again, with the MASH versus Mad Men comparison, it's what's the intent of the film? How is Robert Altman want us to think about this person? And it's fairly disrespectful.
Yes.
And because that's what it is. These are these are the jokes. We having this officious, somewhat goofy person who becomes a sexual object, who is attracted to Frank Burns and all those things that are go on. That's where we're going to find the butt of the joke, for this particular film. And it's funny, in all the research I did, the one thing that someone said very clearly was completely inaccurate was they said the head nurses that they dealt with in these mobile hospitals were tough as nails. Nobody disrespected them. They were the real deal. And this was completely unlike anything that happened at these hospitals.
No surprise. Look, and how can I say that? You know what? I'm going to get in trouble for this, but Steve, you know me. I don't shy away from it.
As long as I don't get in trouble, it's fine.
Yeah, no, please do not. The opinions that are about to come out are alone. But I think, people nowadays sometimes get mad at fandoms, the nerd fandoms, and think the toxicity of the nerd fandoms, and they talk about incels. Let me tell you something about nerd fandoms. From the beginning of nerddom, there has always been this strain of disrespecting or hating women within their comedy, within their programs, within whatever. It has always been there. And certainly we see nowadays, we see from the last few years, like how women have spoken about being in the bullpen with these all male writing staffs and what they have to deal with when it comes to comedy. And what is it usually? It's a bunch of nerdy white dudes who are in there and think they're sexually attractive men, and they really aren't, but they're always being paired up with these beautiful women. And so in TV shows and movies. And so you have this strain of hatred towards good-looking women, hatred towards women who are, a bit more powerful. They feel intimidated by them. So this is not anything new, what you see now in the current nerddom with incels and what have you. This is a historical truth from the beginning of comedy. And when you look back at all the great, it's very tough to find women who are seen as equal or played as equal. I think Gracie Allen and George Burns is maybe one of the most oldest examples of that possibility of their equal in that way. But even she is played a little bit like a little bit.
Yeah, she played for laughs for being dumb.
Yeah, being dumb. Exactly. So this is what I'm saying. But she knew what she was doing. She was, she participated in it and played the character that way. And that happened. But like, this is where you see it come out. And so this idea that sometimes people have like it's only recently that nerds have become toxic. Nerds have always had this. Nerds or geeks or writer nerds, especially writer nerds, have always had this like undercurrent of sexism and misogyny in their writing and in their comedy. And certainly, I think, to me, what Sally Kellerman's character, what O'Houlihan represents in the film, is the biggest example of that. And as you said, Steve, when they look at the women who actually served in these theaters of war this close to the line, they were not people who were conducive to that, or you could portray them in that way. So clearly, this is part of the writer or the original writer of the book working something out in his own hatred of a woman like this.
So now I'm going to say something that might get me in trouble. The opinions expressed here are entirely my own. Nothing to do with those of my partner, John Rocha.
Yes.
But the thing that I think is really important, and this is why it's important, I think, that we have these conversations and not avoid them, is that there can be a thing which moves the ball forward in one era, which can be seen as retrograde in another era. And that it's important to talk about both things at the same time, so that in all sorts of ways, the film MASH moves the ball forward, because all these things were going on. Men were sexually harassing women. People were cutting up, making fun of religion, making jokes over bodies as they're doing surgery. It just wasn't being shown. And so to actually open those things up and say, oh, look at these guys, they were having affairs 7,000 miles away, and they were doing these things and making these jokes. And that's humanity. That's a huge improvement. In some ways, I think the same thing about Animal House, which is Animal House was going, look at how wacky young men are and how obsessed with sex they are and all those things. And those things weren't being talked about. Or a movie like Carnal Knowledge is another movie where it's like, here, let's show you some horribleness here. Yeah. And that is moving the ball forward. Then you can also look at it from a different era and go, it's like we talked about The Breakfast Club or a movie like 16 Candles, which were focusing on teenagers at a certain time and certain ways. And in a lot of ways, they're moving the ball forward. But looking at them from today, you go, ooh, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with Long Duck Dong and the fact that he, rapes the prom queen. I mean, like there's, and that we can hold, and this is a big part of what the Cine-Files is about, is like, we can actually hold both of these thoughts together and say, it was really cool that MASH did this in a lot of ways. And some parts of it now make me uncomfortable,
Right.
Speaking of making someone uncomfortable, we go into post-op and Frank Burns calls for a nurse. There's no nurse there. There's just Bud Cort, whose character's name is Boone.
Boone, get me a cc of adrenaline and a cardiac needle.
All right, now this.
I'm sorry.
Just get it.
Now, Boone is obviously nervous, obviously not a nurse, obviously doesn't know what he's doing. He stutters and stumbles. Boone comes back in.
You idiot, I said a cardiac needle.
You want me to get a nurse?
It's too late, Boone. You killed him.
Yeah.
It is so horrible.
This is why I have no sympathy for Frank Burns.
As you should. Agreed. And man, fucking Bud Cort plays this moment.
Yeah.
You could just see him broken inside. Yeah. And the thing too, that dude was already dead. If he had brought back a cardiac needle, it wasn't going to matter.
Right.
Is that he was dying. You know, it's like this was just Frank Burns blaming somebody else for probably his fuck up.
Well, and Trapper John, after he administers the punch and then speaks about why he did it, you find out that this is a pattern of Frank Burns, is that when anyone dies under his watch, it's not his incompetence, it's God's will or someone else's fault. Again, if you look at Frank Burns as representing the systemic establishment of America and the religious establishment of America, it is that. If people die, it's God's will, and don't blame us for anything we did. Someone else is to blame. We're not going to take the blame for it. And that's what the representation, that's what Frank Burns possibly represents in the movie. And I kept seeing that as I was watching the film.
You know what I think? I think I agree with all of that. And I think that what MASH is attacking is self-righteousness.
Yes.
And part of it too is like, we are the good guys in World War II, you know, and we carry that around. We are the good guys fighting the good fight for the good cause. And then in Korea, it's maybe we're maintaining some of that.
Right. Korea's What Are We Doing Here was the beginning of What Are We Doing Here.
Yeah. And now we're in Vietnam. And there's still, like, if you watch the beginning of Born on the 4th of July, there is that wanting to maintain that spirit of America is right, fighting the good battle for the good cause. And this movie is saying, no, you're not. You're Frank Burns. So this happens. One thing, by the way, Trapper doesn't go to talk to Boone, you know?
No, he doesn't. You're right there.
You know, which I really wish he did, but he doesn't. Houlihan, who sometimes I think is called O'Houlihan and sometimes just called Houlihan. It's very confusing, but she's being shown around the surgery, around pre-op. And then we're like in a supply closet or something. And Frank is there and Trapper comes in and says,
Finished work for the day?
Yes, why?
Good. I just wanted to make sure you had time to sleep this off.
And punches him in the most awkward, lousy punch. And Frank goes down. By the way, in a fight, I am totally betting on Robert Duvall against Elliot Gould. Sorry, Elliot.
He would tear Elliot's insides out. Yeah.
I mean, just with a look.
Yeah, just with a look enough. Yeah, you're right.
Elliot's like, why do we have to fight anyway? I don't see any reason to fight. By the way, you know which movie I'd never seen and I watched fairly recently, which is another Altman and Elliot Gould, is The Long Goodbye.
Oh, yeah. Long Goodbye is great.
So good.
I remember watching that at the Beverly Theater. Remember the one that showed the old movies that Tarantino ended up buying? I remember seeing that one like 10, 15 years ago, walking over and watching it in a double bill of this stuff. And I was surprised by how much I like that movie.
Well, and again, this goes to this weird thing about Altman, which is for the first half hour of that movie, I'm like, what the hell is this?
Yes, right.
And then this is, I was going to say it at some point, but it's like, for me, Altman is kind of magic. And sometimes the magic just doesn't work at all.
Right.
Like sometimes I watch him like, no, this is not. And then there's some time where at a certain point in a movie, it hooks you in this totally unique way. And Long Goodbye is a good example of it, you know? And of course, right at the moment that he punches Frank Burns is the moment that Blake and Houlihan walk in through the door so they get to witness it. And I love Elliot Gould. It goes,
I hit him. He's an ignoramus, that knucklehead.
He wouldn't have touched me if I had my guard up.
you know, and of course, the regular Army Houlihan is disgusted by this behavior. Blake puts Trapper under quote unquote arrest in his quarters.
I love how Trapper blows off everything. Oh, cut it out. Oh, stop. Yeah. And he just kind of walks out of the room.
Well, one of the things, and they really talk about it in the book, is that basically these surgeons had everybody over a barrel because they were saving lives and everybody knew it.
Yep. And they needed them.
And they needed them. Back at the swamp, I love Blake comes in and Trapper's laying down and he goes, and by the way, I love that Trapper, before he was in the park and now he's in like the mummy bag. It's all like up around his face. And he goes,
damn it, Henry. Frank Burns is a menace. Every time a patient croaks on him, he says it's God's will or somebody else's fault.
Yeah, and this time he blamed it on some kid who was stupid enough to believe it.
The hell with that.
Exactly. Yep.
And I think we believe him. We saw what happened with Boone. 100% believe him.
What are you going to do, Henry?
What is this?
Well, I had planned to name Trapper chief surgeon to consult on your shift and Frank's.
That's damn good thinking.
Yeah, but now I can't do it for at least a week.
So, by the way, one of the things is that Ring Lardner was furious when he saw the movie because he felt they threw out all his dialogue. you know,
Really?
because so much of it is improvised.
Oh, wow.
And what he said was, he's like, the structure is exactly the structure he wrote. Every scene has the exact same kind of beginning, middle, and end beats, but the actual words are mostly improvised.
Did you cash the check?
Yeah.
I don't want to hear it.
Well, and guess what? You know, the only Oscar this movie wins is for Ring Lardner. So,
so they, take them all out for burgers.
Yep. And then the camera, as we're listening to more Radio Tokyo songs, it just sort of pans through the campground, and we follow this guy lighting a cigarette, and then we follow it to other people, and we hear little bits of dialogue and other things going on as we're sort of moving through in an organic way.
Yeah.
And this is, I had a full epiphany thinking about this, because like many times, I always like it when I see people making a great movie in exactly the opposite way from how I would teach my students to make a movie. Because it's always good to go like, okay, here is why I'm wrong. And I finally came up with a good metaphor for it, which is, as you know, I've done lots of martial arts, is that in martial arts, there are different styles. So that if you get trained in Taekwondo, you learn to throw a roundhouse kick this way, and you chamber your knee before you throw the kick. Whereas if you're doing Muay Thai, you swing the whole leg straight around, and that's how you do it in this style. This punch is, your wrist is this way, this punch is this way, because you're learning a particular style. Yeah. And I went, oh, I was teaching a particular style of filmmaking, which is planning everything in advance. It's the well-made story. It's everything is there for a reason, is that nothing is wasted. That it's all of that stuff. And that is not Altman's style. Altman's style, we don't know what's important. It doesn't have that sense of everything there for a reason, and that the camera can kind of move around and pick up whatever it picks up. And it's more like a feeling in the more classic Hollywood style is that you are an observer as an audience watching what the director shows you. Whereas with Altman, it's more like I am an observer in the world, looking around and seeing whatever I'm seeing. It feels like you have more control, that you're just kind of seeing everything as it's happening. And just like in life, when you're at a party or something, and a whole bunch of people are saying a whole bunch of stuff, and a whole bunch of stuff doesn't really mean anything, Whereas in a movie, like if you think of a super tight movie, like Back to the Future, a movie, every single sentence is there for a reason. It has to be there. If you took it out, you wouldn't know what the fuck was going on.
Yeah.
That's not true in MASH. In MASH, it's like, well, there's just a bunch of stuff, and it's interesting and it feels real. And it's an entirely different way of thinking about film.
There's no what's the arc?
None.
There's none of that here. It's just, as you said, a series of vignettes, a series of scenes, and we move through. And Altman kind of smartly is like, well, I'm gonna show these mofos what I can do with a camera. And in a way, it worked. It serves the film, him doing these interesting new things with a camera to kind of keep us distracted as viewers. I bet people subconsciously were like, wow, this is awesome, but not consciously maybe catching what he was doing with the camera. They just kind of felt it at a subconscious level that this was something they'd never really seen before, and found themselves entertained even by just the camera movements in a film like this.
Totally. And then the other thing that happens is, because of this, is that you didn't really know if you were being shot. So you're acting in this space, and the camera's roving around, and you can't look over to see if the camera's looking at you, because then you're eyeballing the camera. So you can't do that. Right. So it could be that the camera might be picking you up at any particular moment. So you always had to be on, even if you were an ensemble character. Yeah. And then the way that you traditionally mic a movie is that you have the boom guy, which is a guy with a big pole with a mic, and he knows the script, and he aims that microphone at whoever's talking. So you have a line, I aim the mic at you, then I have a line, I aim the mic at me, because it's on the script. And then maybe, particularly today, you have a lavalier, which is a little wireless microphone that you'd also have on each body. And so maybe you're tracking 3 tracks or 4 tracks of audio. Well, what Altman started to do in this movie, but then it really became his signature later on, he wanted everybody mic'd, because everybody could say anything. So later on, they had developed these systems where they'd have 16 tracks or 24 tracks of audio, and this camera roving around. And so you could be way in the background of a shot and say a line, and that line could end up in the movie. So everybody had to be always on, always engaged, and they never knew what was going to be important or not important, because only Altman knew what was going on.
Fascinating. Okay.
Here's the downside of this, is that we have this ensemble, and the camera is maybe favoring Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould a little bit more than everybody else, but not a lot more. And it feels like they're just part of a big ensemble. And Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould felt that they were the stars.
Oh.
And so, and the other thing too is they had both done movies shot in more traditional ways, and they're looking at how Altman's making a movie, and they're like, this guy is crazy. This is never going to work. And so they wrote a letter to try to get Robert Altman fired.
Wow.
A few weeks into the production.
Oh my God.
Whether or not it was because they felt that Altman was incompetent or because he wasn't paying enough attention to them as stars, they have different stories about it. But then after a week or so, they started watching the dailies, they went, oh, he might not be crazy. He might be a genius. And then they settled back in.
Right.
Interestingly enough, after the film, Elliot Gould wrote a letter to Altman apologizing for this incident and thanking him and praising the film. And Elliot Gould worked with Robert Altman many, many times after this, including Long Goodbye, we just discussed.
Yeah.
Donald Sutherland wrote no such letter and never worked with Robert Altman again.
I stand by my convictions, Robert.
Attention, may I have the camp's attention? This week's movie will be When Willie Comes Marching Home, the biggest parade of laughs of World War II. All the loves, laughs, and escapades of the Willies who came marching home.
So this seems like the perfect opportunity to bring this up. So the voiceover guy for all of these announcements is Marvin Miller. Marvin Miller is a legendary voiceover guy from the 40s and 50s. He is best remembered for voicing Robbie the Robot in 1956's Forbidden Planet, which he reprised in the lesser-known The Invincible Boy later on. But yeah, he did a number of things, working in radio, working on camera. He won 2 Grammy Awards in 65 and 66 for his recording of Dr. Seuss stories on RCA Records. He was in the James Cagney film Blood on the Sun. He was in the Humphrey Bogart film Dead Reckoning. He played Asian roles. So I wonder if he is the one voicing over the Japanese announcements in the movie. I couldn't find anywhere where they confirmed that or not, but I would not be surprised if he was a part of it. He also did the narration for, if you guys remember, the old cartoon Gerald McBoing Boing and the Ant and the Aardvark cartoon Scratch a Tiger. So he was part of that as well. So he was prolific in so many ways as a voiceover guy, and also did the voice of Aquaman for the 1967 series, The Superman / Aquaman Our Adventure, and was the pilot scientist Busby Birdwell in the animated series Fantastic Voyage. He'd also did a voice for Land of the Lost and the Pink Panther show. So yeah, a number of things he did voiceover wise here. So he was the perfect choice because he had worked on so many of the old radio shows to kind of simulate what the voice would sound like for a 1950s Korean War voiceover guy over the intercoms there. So it was a great choice, and he clearly played the comedy up because he's such a seasoned actor. He clearly played the comedy up perfectly.
It's so critical to the movie, the way he stumbles over these things and the slightly offness and all of that.
Yeah.
It just makes the absurdity just come to life, I think.
100%. 100%.
Captain Pierce, may I join you?
You've already joined me, gorgeous. You're a sight to sore eyes. Where do you come from?
Well, I like to think of the Army as my home.
And his reaction to that, it's like, oh, we're done. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You had a shot to be irreverent. You're not.
And she wants to talk to him about his shift and asks about the nurses.
To know what I think of the nurses on my team. I think they're fine. I think they're just great.
And then we cut to surgery in the middle of this. Yeah. And we're going to illustrate why this team is so great, because immediately there's a blackout and we see the flashlights coming out and all the stuff coming out. And then as we're doing surgery, still trying to save lives, they start singing.
When the lights go on again.
Got enough room?
And there's this great feeling, and I think they just so nail it, of the camaraderie of this group saving lives under these terrible, terrible conditions and still finding ways to make it fun, make it positive,
Agreed.
Which is why when we come back and she says,
Well, Major Burns is far from satisfied.
Well, that doesn't surprise me.
That's, again, this puts her in the role of the enemy.
Frank Burns does not know his way around an operating theater. He does not know his way around a body. And if you will have observed anything, you will have observed that Major Frank Burns is an idiot. He has flipped his wig, that he's out of his head, that he's a lousy surgeon.
And she says, and with passion and verve, I think, she says,
Oh, on the contrary, I have observed that Major Burns is not only a good technical surgeon, he is a good military surgeon.
What does that mean, a good military surgeon?
That he gets the job done as quickly as possible and with no empathy, just gets the job done.
So I will say, again, you served in the military, I didn't. I don't think she's talking about surgery at all.
Oh.
I think she is talking about crossing I's and dotting T's and demanding that people call him Major Burns and not his first name and all the stuff that isn't surgery,
Fair point. Yeah.
Because the next thing she says is,
I've also noticed that nurses as well as enlisted men address you as Hawkeye.
Yeah, because that's my name, Hawkeye Pierce.
Well, that kind of informality is inconsistent with maximum efficiency in a military organization.
Come off it, Major.
And that's it for Hawkeye.
Yeah.
He goes, oh, come off it, Major. You put me right off my fresh fried lobster. Do you realize? And I love that it's like, you're not eating lobster. He goes,
I'm going to go back to my bed. I'm going to put away the best part of a bottle of scotch. And under normal circumstances, you being normally what I would call a very attractive woman, I would have invited you back to share my little bed with me, and you might possibly have come. But you really put me off. I mean, you're what we call a regular Army clown.
You have those, being an enlisted guy, you kind of get it, right? You get the bullshit and the realness, and the people who come in with the super overt military approach to things, it's because they're working some shit out from their own lives and they need the regimented shit just to be able to function. And it's control. It's absolutely control. It does not mean, however, that the regimented stuff isn't effective. Of course it is. The military wouldn't function without it because it's such a crazy thing to be a part of. But there are people who understand when to use it, when not to use it, and when not to brag about it or not to enforce it in certain ways that make you come off like a stick in the mud. That's the difference. Because we're all part of it because we've asked to be part of it, but we also want understanding about like that this isn't something that you're always doing and always adhering to every second of every day. So you got to find that balance. And so him giving her these opportunities and her just completely not showing any desire to waver on these tenets already tells him what kind of person this is,
Well, and it's also just in terms of filmmaking, one of the things about this movie, because it is so episodic, this is not the order that the movie was intended to be in some ways. There are things that get moved around.
Right.
So I don't know. I have no evidence for this. I don't know whether or not that scene with the blackout and them singing was always intended to fall directly in the middle of this other scene. Structurally, that's weird because we don't know if it happened before. We're leaving the middle of a scene to go look at something that happened at a totally different time and then coming back to that scene.
Yeah.
The fact that we did it, that choice in post-production to put that scene in the middle is why Margaret looks stupid in this moment, because we just saw how awesome these people are.
Yeah.
And now, and Hawkeye's saying they're great, and it's great that they call me by my first name, and Frank is an idiot, which we also just saw because he blamed Boom for dying.
Yeah.
So Margaret comes back and says he's an excellent technical surgeon and a military surgeon, and this is how it's supposed to be. We are on Team Hawkeye 100%.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think this is where people sometimes cop out with the movie and say like, oh, well, no, it's just showing you how it is. No, the movie is taking a point of view. The editing gives you the point of view of the movie about every character in this movie. And they completely edit this film to make O'Houlihan be a bit of a villain or a stuck-up person. But she's not wrong, actually, in most of the stuff she wants to do in these situations.
Well, and the treatment of her, which we're going to get to, is terrible, in a lot of ways.
100%.
But the button on the scene is perfect. which is after Hawkeye leaves. She says,
I wonder how a degenerated person like that could have reached a position of responsibility in the Army Medical Corps.
He was drafted.
That's just perfect.
Yeah. But it's a perfect commentary also on the military, right? Because they're like, well, we're so desperate for this. We're going to draft these people and put them in these positions and expect them to do these things and adhere to this military code. But we know they're not going to. But we're going to live in hope that they will.
Well, this is the thing. We're going to take these 20-year-olds fresh out of medical school. We're going to fly them 7,000 miles away, put them in dangerous situations where life and death is in their hands over and over again. And particularly if having just reread the book, it could be day after day after day of just constant surgery, desperately trying to save lives. And then we go, and now we like to expect you to, behave with the Marquis of Queensberry rules in perfect military precision. Right. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Like this, they're in a, again, I go back to that thing Altman said is like, oh, you think this is obscene? War is obscene. Yeah. The real obscenity here is the war. Well, and I think at this moment where we've really shown clearly the conflict between Trapper and Frank Burns and between Hawkeye and Margaret, that I think this is a good moment to end part 1 of our exploration of Robert Altman's MASH. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to visit us on all of the social media like Facebook, you can do a search for The Cine-Files. On Twitter, it's Cine_Files. Instagram, The Cine-Files Podcast. And of course, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, you can support us by going to patreon.com/The Cine-Files. And there you can have access to all of our tiers, all the way up to our advisory board, who helped form what we're doing this whole month on the Cine-Files. But if you want to get just ad-free versions of the show and our Cine-Files shorts, well, that's on Apple Podcasts. You could just subscribe very easily there. If you want to buy or stream MASH along with every other movie we've ever reviewed, that's on cinephiles.net. And if you want to reach me, it's SR Morris on Twitter and SR Morris1 on Instagram. John, how would folks find you?
You can always find me at The Rocha Says on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and my YouTube channel, youtube.com/John Rocha Says. That's the Outlaw Nation. Just type in that in the search field and you'll find all the stuff we do there on the channel and my other podcasts, The Geek Buddies and The Hot Mic, that are out there for you all to enjoy as well.
And I think that is it for this week. We will see you next time for part 2 of MASH right here on the Cine-Files.